we hear so much about Winthrop, but you've got to realize that the contribution coming from the Boston, England was immense. And not everybody has connected these dots, but they need to be connected.
Privileged to be here in this venerable meeting house, particularly tonight to have a distinguished group of discussants, whom I will now introduce, beginning with your far left, Allison Austin, a counselor. She's represented St. Thomas's Ward on the Boston Council since March of 2007, and she served as the 480th mayor of Boston. And Councilor Austin also serves, actually, for 15 years she taught at the Boston Grammar School, which, as we know, is the forerunner of the Boston Latin School of venerable fame here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. She taught math. Her college education was in math and human geography. And as mayor of Boston back in the, about 5 years ago, she was one of the signatories of the New Mayflower Compact, which was drawn up to mark preparations for the 400th anniversary of the sailing of the Pilgrim Fathers to North America, a commemoration, a celebration that we will be holding along with our brothers and sisters across the Atlantic in 2020. And she also serves as secretary of the Boston Heritage Forum, an institution looking to commemorate the heritage of the Boston of England, Boston of Lincolnshire. And next to her is Councilor Richard Austin. And I still haven't learned what your relationship is to each other. They're very excuse me? Okay, good. He was also mayor of Boston. He was the 481st mayor of Boston. That is, he succeeded Allison as mayor of Boston, and he's also served as a county councilor. And he is the founding chairman of the Boston Marathon UK Association, and they run a marathon as close to the date of our marathon as is possible. And his background is in agriculture and horticulture, but he has a great interest in the heritage of his adopted home of Boston. Like many of us, he is an adopted Bostonian, and he's currently preparing an illustrated booklet summarizing the area's heritage for the last 1,000 years, and also leading a group planning a heritage conference, which will be happening in Boston, England, in September of 2019. That is a year from now, September 7th, 2019, which will be focusing on the part played by people from the area of Boston, Lincolnshire, and the founding of Boston in Massachusetts. And he's also keenly aware of the need to get ready for the commemorations of 2030, a date that looms large in our Boston collective imagination. And next to them is Neil Wright, who is a historian of Boston, Lincolnshire. And since 1964, he has written many books and articles about Boston and the wider world of Lincolnshire. Right now, he's working on a book about Boston during the Georgian Age, roughly from the 1760s to the 1840s. And he's also been chairman of the Society for Lincolnshire History and Archaeology. And this is his 6th or 7th visit to our Boston, where he's given talks on the links between our two communities. And the gentleman at my table is the 7th great-grandson of the Reverend John Cotton. Barry Cotton was for 5 years chairman, national president and chairman of the Winthrop Society, which he now serves as emeritus status as president chairman of the Winthrop Society. He is a member of the Massachusetts Society of the Cincinnati, as well as the Ancient and Honorable Artillery Company of Massachusetts and the Society of Mayflower Descendants. And since 2002, he's been a trustee in the Partnership of the Historic Bostons. And Yves LaPlante is perhaps the leading historian of 17th century New England. I say that guardedly, looking around to see what other historians of 17th century New England. She is a Bostonian. She has degrees both from Harvard and from a well-known college in New Jersey, and has published numerous articles, essays, as well as 5 works of nonfiction. Her latest is a biography of Louisa May Alcott's relationship with her mother Abigail, Marmee and Louisa, which NPR named one of the top 10 books of the year. And she's probably best known in this particular circle as the author of American Jezebel about Anne Hutchinson, and for her wonderful biography of Judge Samuel Sewall. So I think we'll just start asking Allison and Richard, since it's possible that not everyone in our audience is familiar with Boston, Lincolnshire. It might be helpful if you tell us a little bit about Boston.
Okay. Well, thank you for the introduction, and I'll try and live up to it. Right. Well, Boston, as you realize, is a small town in Lincolnshire, but not everyone clearly is quite sure of where Lincolnshire is. So Lincolnshire is that large hole in the UK between East Anglia and Yorkshire. It's not East Anglia, it's not Yorkshire, it's not East Midlands. It's that large county in between, a rural county. Now, Boston is a small port and market town, essentially on the east coast of England. It's slightly about 4 miles upriver and about 120 miles north of London. It is the second town in Lincolnshire, which, as I've said, is a very rural county, but it is a rather isolated town with quite poor infrastructure nowadays, linking it to the largest centres of population, because although turning the clock back several hundred years, the main, perhaps, way of communicating or travelling was by water. Now it is those many, many waterways that have caused the isolation, because you've got to get across them. Right, so from being England's second port in the 13th century, and then ships have got larger, trade has changed, really, Boston has declined in its importance relative to other places in town, in the country. And when we talk about Boston, like here, I think, we're talking about the wider administration, administrative borough of Boston. And together, I think we'd say there's a population of about 75,000 people. We say about because it's really, it's an unknown quantity, because we've had a lot of inward migration. We've had a lot of people from what we loosely call Eastern Europe come to us. We've had immigration over the years, but it's in the last 10 years that we've had this significant increase, with about 15% coming in adding to the population, coming in from these Eastern European countries. So that has made quite a sizable change to Boston itself. And they came to Boston because changes in agriculture meant that we needed the labour, and these people were willing and happy to come and do jobs. So they have arrived, some have moved on, some have brought families, but now we have a very significant part of our population. So out of those 75,000, yes, there are a lot of Eastern Europeans, and a lot of them youngish males. I think that's perhaps where I pause for the moment, because I think you have some slides now.
There's a few up.
Yes.
There's a slide now.
Mm-hmm. Right, well, this first slide then shows us some bottles, which you can see clearly there. That is our landmark. And just behind that, running across, you will see the river. That's the Witham. And there is one other thing that's perhaps important. You'll see a large road snaking its way across That is called John Adams Way. Oh, I thought you would like that. Right, there's one of the many waterways as well at the front, the Lord Foster Way. Right, now we move on to St Botolph's itself. That is the jewel in our crown, obviously, and that is the marketplace. It's a very large marketplace, and we'll see more about this. Yes, here we've got one of the windows, excellent stained glass windows, but this one is special because this is the John Cotton window showing, in fact, depicting John Cotton bidding farewell, as it says, to the Puritans, some of them on their way boarding the Arbella. Sorry? I can speak louder. Yes. Right, we move now to Boston Grammar School, where I taught briefly, but this, of course, was the school that was the foundation of your Latin school. And it's taken from what's called the Mart Yard, a former place where there would have been markets each year. And this now, the Guildhall, one of Boston's oldest buildings, the Guild of St Mary. I expect Neil will tell us a little bit about that in due course. But if we move inside it, these are the cells where in 1604 some of the Pilgrim Fathers were imprisoned when they were trying to leave England to join up with the Mayflower some years later. But at this stage, they were on their way to Holland. Now, another significant older building in Boston, that's the Blackfriars, a former friary that now has been transformed into a theatre and arts centre. And leading down from the marketplace towards the Guildhall, the black and white building there is the Shod Friars, another of the many friaries, or relating to one of the other friaries that were in Boston. Right, we move now to Fidel House, a very fine Georgian house that is alongside the Guildhall. And, right, the coat of arms of Boston, regretfully the former coat of arms, because with local government reorganisation, unfortunately they created a modern version of this, but this is the best one. This is the real one, with the 3 coronets and that motto, per mare et per terram. Maud Foster windmill, of course, a lot of windmills traditionally in Boston and throughout Lincolnshire. And finally, the council chamber. Yes, I sat in that chair for a year. Well, not for a year, but each time there was a council meeting, as did Richard, yes. And compared with teaching a class of boys, it is no problem at all sitting in the Right, well, that's brought us then, I think. Right, this is Sempringham. It's 18 miles southwest of Boston. Nowadays, there's no village at all, really, but it's the site of an old Gilbertine monastery that will be referred to. And this shows the location of the old monastery, where the Earl's house was built. And it's arranged around 3 sides of a central courtyard, with a second courtyard to the south, with outbuildings around it. Now we go to another important place. This is the parish church of St Andrews.
No, it's Tattershall.
Oh. We've changed the order, sorry. Tattershall Castle, that's another very well-known landmark within Lincolnshire today. But that was the second home of the Earl of Lincoln, And this is a 17th century illustration of it. Now then, this is the, yes, this is the modern photograph of Tattershall Castle with the very fine collegiate church alongside it. And if we move on. We've now gone back to Sempringham. Sorry, the order had changed. And this is what remains of the parish church of St Andrew, but part of this dates back to the 11th century.
Yeah, go back. Yeah.
Now,
Okay.
that's the slides.
Well, thank you.
I think we now move on to you.
Boston, UK has a low-wage economy based on intensive agriculture and horticulture. There are several large packhouses in the borough that supply supermarkets throughout the UK. You can say that Boston feeds the nation. There is also supporting industry, and the largest employer actually is the district hospital, which serves the eastern half of Lincolnshire and attracts a goodly number of professional people and their families to the town. Unfortunately, at the moment, there's a debate about its status, so watch this space. In Lincolnshire, there's a growing visitor and tourist economy, but it is relatively undeveloped in Boston, and something we would like to rectify, and that's one of the reasons for our visit. Boston regards itself as a market town that is isolated, as Alison has said, and sometimes we feel a little bit overlooked and marginalised by the other parts of the UK. But incomers find it's a good place to live, but locals who live there all the time don't always appreciate that. And probably as with you, the local media tends to concentrate on negative stories, which gives a misleading impression.
Okay, thank you very much, Richard and Alison. Neil, could you take us back up to the 17th century and tell us a bit about how Boston, England was governed at that time?
Yes, thank you. Basically, Boston is nearly about 1,000 years old. It came into existence about the period between 1086 and 1089. We've got information about it at that time. It didn't really exist. There might just have been a crossing over the river, but it wouldn't necessarily have been a settlement. But it was then created immediately then, very soon after the Norman Conquest, and as I say, came into existence and flourished during the medieval period as a port. It did not have a corporation to run it until 1545, when King Henry VIII gave the town a charter, and a borough council, a corporation, was incorporated to run the council and to run the town. That had a mayor, 12 aldermen and 18 common councilmen. And it was a self-electing body in that whenever the first members were named in the charter, and when any vacancy arose, it was the members of the corporation who chose that successor, so that democracy didn't come in until 1835, when the people of the town were able to elect the councillors. The responsibilities of the corporation related to running the markets and fairs of the town, to running the port of Boston, maintaining the harbour and the wharves and things like that. Also, it appointed the vicar of the church, and it appointed the master of the grammar school, and really it was in charge of much of the cultural activity within the town. It was running the charities which had been created and donated over time. It didn't have full responsibility for everything that was done in the town. Some was the responsibility of the parish. Parish was a church title for areas around the parish church, but gradually, since the reign of Queen Elizabeth, or from the 16th century, parishes were given governmental responsibilities for services within their township, so that the parish was responsible for looking after the poor by appointing a guardian of the poor. It appointed a surveyor of the highways, and he would organise any work that was necessary to maintain the highways of the town. But they also appointed, the parish appointed church wardens to look after repairs to the church and to ensure church attendance took place. So you had these two levels of government taking place. Within the corporation councillors, the councillors and the aldermen elected the mayor. The mayor was elected once a year, and it wasn't what we might now think of as a mayor being the head of the executive. The mayor was very much the figurehead, the speaker of the council. He would choose speakers and administer various matters, the ceremonial head of the town, but also to run the council meetings. A number of mayors within this period, within the early 17th century, which we're now thinking about, had connections with the movement over here to Massachusetts. First of all, there was Anthony Hawkwood, who was mayor in 1821. He had three daughters. One was Mary, who married Thomas Coney, the town clerk of Boston, so that was another connection. The town clerk was responsible for clerking and running the business of the council. A second daughter, Elizabeth, married Thomas's brother, John Coney. John Coney, in fact, then moved over to Massachusetts, and I think it's his grandson who taught the father of Paul Revere. So there's a direct connection there. The Coney had been a silversmith in this city and passed those skills on to Paul Revere, who is perhaps the more famous name. The third daughter, Sarah, married John Cotton as his second wife. So again, the name John Cotton known here. And after that, after the death of John Cotton, she married Richard Mather. So again, these are the three daughters of one mayor of Boston, Lincolnshire, so one marrying the person whose eventually descendants taught Paul Revere, and the other who was connected with well-known names here of Cotton and Mather. So that was the Hawkwood family. Another mayor in 1826 was John Whiting, and his son Samuel later emigrated here. Their connection was at quite a powerful level within the United Kingdom, within Britain, in that he was married to the sister of Oliver St. John, who became the Chief Justice of England during the Cromwellian period. And the third member to mention as a mayor was Atherton Howe. He was mayor in 1826. And again, him and his son rather, emigrated over to Massachusetts. So three mayors, very close connections with Massachusetts, showing that it was the elite running the Boston in Lincolnshire. It wasn't just ordinary people, even middle-class people. It was very much people involved in the leading part of Boston, Lincolnshire, who were involved in joining in with Massachusetts. In fact, the one I have not yet mentioned was the man who was the recorder, that is, judge of Boston, and his name was Richard Bellingham, which I think also is a name that is well known in this city. Finally, particularly in relation to Richard Bellingham, as well as being the town mayor and judge, he was also a member of Parliament. In those days, each borough within England sent 2 members to Parliament in same way that each county, and so Bellingham served as member of Parliament. For much of that time, actually, he didn't need to do anything because this was in the period he was elected in. Opened down the date, but in the late 1820s, just after King Charles had come to the throne in 1825, and King Charles actually then ruled without Parliament. So although technically Bellingham was a member, Parliament was not actually called at that time, and he was still technically a member when in due course he then emigrated to Massachusetts as well.
Great, thank you. So if we can then turn to the early 17th century, I wonder if you can tell us a bit about what Boston, England was like in the pivotal year of 1618.
Sure. I was going to talk a little about the most important person in the town at the time in 1618, and that was John Cotton, who you heard a little bit about. At this time, he was in his early 30s. And he was to become very important in early Boston here. He'd been there for 6 years, And that year, just to give you a sense, the population of the town of Boston was 3,000, and he conducted 90 baptisms, 93 burials, and 39 marriages. But more important than that, he was in the process of becoming the Mick Jagger of Puritan England. And this was a pivotal year for him and for the church there. And I'll just give you a little background and then try to explain some of the arc of his life. At the age of 12, he'd gone to Cambridge, and he spent the next 15 years there getting 3 degrees, and he was born again during those years, and it became a very devout Puritan Calvinist. And then in the year 1612, he became the vicar of Boston, which was his first preaching job, I believe, outside college. And at that very same summer, just to bring in the Anne Hutchinson story a little, Anne Hutchinson was married to Will Hutchinson, and they moved back to their hometown of Alford, which is well, you can't see it now, but 24 miles to the north. And like many Puritans, the Hutchinsons would look around for the best preacher, because the quality of the preaching was the most important thing to the Puritans. So they were violating the Act of Uniformity, which required you to go to your parish church. So they would sort of like church hunt, I don't know what you call it now, but one of the churches she'd heard about, she was extremely devout, she heard about this John Cotton in Boston, and so she and Will rode on horses, probably on a horse together, which 24 miles would have taken about 6 hours to Boston from Alford, and then listened to his lengthy sermon standing in the stone church with hundreds of other people. Apparently Cotton was spellbinding. And then ride 6 hours back to Alford. So you sort of want to get a little sense of what it was that he was saying that was so incredibly appealing. What was attracting her, I'm just trying to get my papers here together. What was attracting her was his peculiar theology, people have called it. It combined two seemingly opposite doctrines. One is absolute grace, and the other is conditional reprobation. And absolute grace means that God's grace is given absolutely to those who are elected before birth. So there's nothing you can do by the way of duties or actions to bring about your own salvation. Conditional reprobation means that human depravity, or that is being damned before birth, is conditional on your misbehavior during life, which God decreed in his foreknowledge of human behavior. It gets to be a little confusing, but another way of saying it is that once you're justified by God's grace, your actions are by definition good. And at the same time, a true saint, for these people they viewed themselves as saints, is overwhelmed by a sense of his helplessness. And this is a good quote from Cotton on that. When you look at duties or works, you're not able to do them, not able to hear or pray or write. He believed that human work is empty without God. And after justification, the Holy Ghost becomes one with the saint, the person. And as a result, many people in his congregation, including Anne Hutchinson, believed in this notion that the Holy Spirit dwells within us, within the Calvinist saint. So that gives you a little bit of a sense of what was appealing to her. And one of his problems was that he was a nonconformist, as was Anne Hutchinson, and that there were Puritans operating within the Anglican Church, which they were sort of fighting against. And in the parish in Boston, there were some people that adhered more to the Anglican practices, like standing during the Lord's Prayer and having regular Holy Communion, and then there were many Puritans, like the Hutchinsons. And there was it was almost like there were two congregations for a period. And so it was a problem for Cotton. And Cotton was a sort of a man who somehow was able to come up with a good solution for every problem. And these were serious problems. There was a wonderful description by another Puritan minister that I just found the other day. Samuel Ward, during the period right before they came here, he said, "Of all the men in the world, I envy Mr. Cotton of Boston most. For he doth nothing in way of conformity, yet hath his liberty, and I do everything that way, and cannot enjoy mine." So Cotton is somehow operating as a very intense Puritan in this world where it's not entirely acceptable, and he really wasn't sure how he could preach to the people who were the reprobates, the people that were not elected before birth. So the answer he came up with to this problem was a phrase in chapter 2 of the Song of Solomon: "As the lily amongst thorns, so is my love among the daughters." He believed that the lily was the elect, and the thorns were those with whom the elect held fellowship, but those were the reprobate people. And so the true believers didn't need to separate from the church, but they should show within the larger congregation some kind of special status. He said, "The church may be Christ's love, yea, and a fragrant and pure flower in his sight and nostrils, and yet live amongst briars and thorns." So in 1618, a second priest was brought in, and he was actually ministering to the more Anglican people, the Thorns, at the same time as John Cotton was preaching to the Lilies. And they were sort of going literally back and forth at the doorway and having two separate services. And in creating this congregation within a congregation, John Cotton was basically creating the Congregational Church, although they didn't call it that yet. But it was the early Congregational Church, and it was sort of formed in 1618 in Boston with these two sort of congregations functioning side by side.
Thank you. So speaking then as the lily among the thorns, Barry, can you tell us why Boston was on the verge of change in 1618?
Yeah, this period became very ripe, and change came to Boston from the outside. In 1618, the third Earl of Lincoln was nearly on his deathbed, and his son, Theophilus, was enrolled in Queen's College, Cambridge, in preparation to fill his father's shoes. Cotton Mather wrote about this transition, saying, "In 1616, Henry de Clinton, Earl of Lincoln, died, his title descending to his son Thomas. The latter survived but 3 years to enjoy his honors, and left his son Theophilus, a young man, a large estate heavily encumbered with his father's debts. In this emergency, Thomas Dudley was recommended to the young Earl as a steward by Lord Say and Sell, Lord Compton, and others who had satisfied themselves of his worth and ability. He accordingly took the entire charge of the Earl's large estate, and by his skillful management, in the space of a few years, entirely freed the estate from the debts with which it was laden." So as a result, Thomas Dudley, his daughter, who we know as Anne Bradstreet, Anne Dudley Bradstreet, her husband, Simon Bradstreet, and others in Dudley's family played a major role in Boston, even though they weren't native Bostonians. This timeline is going to track some changes in Boston from about 1618 to 1626. I think it's somewhat legible for you. The yellow highlight indicates events related to the circle of the Earl of Lincoln. And earlier we showed you the slides of Sempringham and Tattershall, and those played very important because they were, one was north, one was south of Boston, but that's where his residents were. The blue highlights indicates that events that relate to the crown. In 1620, King James I sanctioned the Great Council of New England and gave it the power to issue companies' charters for land in New England. All right? The vast majority of what we call the Great Migration was enabled by this council, headed by the Earl of Warwick and Ferdinando Gorges. Both men were absolute opportunistic upstarts. Absolutely. The Earl of Warwick had actually purchased that title from King James for 10,000 pounds. Now, if any of you know England, there's a beautiful Warwick Castle. He didn't get that. That belonged to the family that it would rightfully belong to, but James needed money. He sold titles, which really alienated the aristocracy. Now, his son, Robert Rich, the second Earl of Warwick, was a notorious privateer. Most say pirate, okay? And a devotee of the Puritan cause. Of all the privateering ships that sailed between 1626 and 1630, it's estimated that half sailed for Warwick. His colonial ventures were distinguished by the establishment of godly communities, the plundering of Spanish trade, and a return of profits to investors. So, you know, this story is very rich, and it has a lot of characters that many of us are not really familiar with. In 1623, the Dorchester Company was one of the first ventures to obtain a charter from the Council of New England. And as will be discussed later, John Humphrey, the treasurer of the Dorchester Company, played a key role in the founding of the Massachusetts Bay Company. Between 1618 and 1625, shown in yellow, Sempringham had become a hothouse of young talent and radical ideas. In 1622, the Earl of Lincoln married Lady Bridget Fens, the daughter of Lord Say and Sell. A year later, in 1623, the Earl's younger sister, Lady Arbella, married Isaac Johnson. Key figure. The King's Chapel burial ground used to be called Isaac Johnson's burial ground. Unfortunately, he died, but he was the financier of the Mass Bay Company. Okay? He was absolutely the financier. Isaac Johnson was a recent graduate of Emmanuel College, Cambridge. And as an aside, I just want to note that, as Eve mentioned, John Cotton spent 16 years at Cambridge, the last 10 of which were at Emmanuel College, where he served as a fellow and head lecturer. And Emmanuel College graduates are a distinct cohesive group that populated the majority of New England churches in that first generation. Anyway, back to the slide. In the year 1623, the year Isaac Johnson married Lady Arabella, William Blackstone, which I hope is a name most of you recognize, across from the Founders Memorial, there's a plaque to him, was Johnson's best friend and his roommate at Emmanuel College, and he had sailed to New England with Robert Gorges, the son of Fernando Gorges. And 2 years later, in 1625, he settled the Shawmut Peninsula that became Boston. His participation in the Gorges expedition was facilitated by his best friend's wife, Lady Arbella, whose older sister had married John Gorges, the brother of Robert Gorges, who led the expedition. And it's worth mentioning that William Blackstone was, of course, from Horncastle, which is about 19 miles north of Boston. Now, the bond between the Clinton and the Gorges families was first established by the first Earl of Lincoln, Henry Clinton. when he acquired a servant named Nicholas Gorges. At the time, Lincoln was the Lord Lieutenant of Lincolnshire, and in 1584 he appointed Gorges to represent Boston in Parliament. Later in 1597, Nicholas Gorges's nephew, Arthur, married Theophilus Clinton's aunt. Okay, now this is key. Manipulating these family ties, Ferdinando Gorges conspired with the Dowager Countess of Lincoln to obtain a charter for the Mayflower Pilgrims in 1619. Their original charter was done this way. She couldn't put it in her own name, and quote, this is from some recollections that came out later in Plymouth, by the advice of some friends, this patent was not taken in the name of any of their own company, but in the name of Mr. John Wincub, a religious gentleman then belonging, not working, but belonging to the Countess of Lincoln, who intended to go with them. Later that year, however, John Wincub died, and a nearly identical patent was granted to John Pierce, and it was with this patent that the Pilgrims sailed to Plymouth. Back to the timeline, in 1625, King James died and Charles I ascended the throne. The following year, Charles suspended Parliament and imposed a forced loan. Very important to the story of Boston, Massachusetts. He imposed this forced loan on nobles and gentry to raise money in support of his uncle, King Christian of Denmark, okay, because his mother had been a Danish princess. And this was after Christian was defeated at the Battle of Lutter in the 30 Years' War. At the time, Charles swore he would render his uncle every assistance, even at the risk of his crown and his life. Okay? Ironically, Charles' words proved prophetic, because 23 years later, he lost both his crown and his head. Okay? Speaking against this forced loan and for refusing to pay his share, the Earl of Lincoln was arraigned by the Privy Council, fined £3,000, and sentenced to the Tower of London for 2 years. Well, that's tough. Members of the Boston Corporation, okay, had Richard and Allison been there, they probably would have been put in jail with the rest of them. So, although it was less than 8 years since Thomas Dudley arrived at Sempringham, okay, until the Earl was imprisoned in the Tower of London, change had come to Boston and altered the course of history. And we've got more to tell about that.
Well, thank you, Barry. Now, Richard and Allison, as Barry just mentioned, there is a connection then between the Mayflower, the Pilgrims, and the town of Boston. And in Boston, England, I am told that there are many institutions named for the Pilgrims. That is, this legacy is part of the heritage of Boston, England, surprising as it may be, since I spend a lot of time when I'm teaching my students about the 17th century, telling them that the Pilgrims and the Puritans were separate and distinct, and now I find out I have to change the way I teach. So if you could elaborate a bit on the connection between...
Yes, there's certainly great confusion in Boston, England, concerning the Pilgrims, the Puritans, and the Mayflower, and they have merged into one story. The Pilgrim Fathers, commonly known as the Separatists, only came to Boston for a short time in 1604 and have little real connection with this Boston. The strong link between the two Bostons was the Puritans, based on the St. Botolph's congregation in 1620. The Separatists, or the Pilgrim Fathers, wanted to separate from the English Church completely. The Puritans, on the other hand, wanted to reform the Church from within. The Pilgrim Fathers travelled about 50 miles to Boston in 1604 to board a vessel to take them to Holland, seeking religious freedom. Boston was conveniently situated on the East Coast, and its people likely to be sympathetic to their religious views. They unfortunately were betrayed by the Dutch captain of the ship. The militia detained them for a short time in the town. The leaders were thought to have been jailed in the Guildhall, as you've heard, before being tried in Lincoln and eventually released. Many of these pilgrims subsequently escaped to Holland via a different route. 13 years later, they boarded the Mayflower in Southampton and landed in New England, as you know, in 1620. The Guildhall is one of Boston's most historic buildings, and its cells are preserved, as you've seen, and proudly show off as being the Pilgrim Fathers, where they were thought to have been imprisoned. We can be certain, however, that the Mayflower never sailed from Boston. Lincolnshire, including Boston, have been a stronghold of religious nonconformism. The Boston MA link is some 10 years later with John Cotton. John Cotton and his followers were Puritans. He was the vicar of St. Botolph's, which we know as Boston Stump, and had attracted a number of academic followers, as you've heard, to Boston. The other panel members will be expanding on this. In many people's minds, the names Pilgrim and Mayflower have become synonymous, and the words are well used in Boston, UK. One might say overused. So our connection with the USA is greatly valued, but the dramatic Pilgrim story is easier to grasp and rather than the Puritan story. The hospital, the local football team, the social housing company, and a road are all named Pilgrim or Mayflower. So there's no wonder the importance of the Pilgrims to our history is overblown by we in the UK, the Bostonians. Although there are a number of Puritan names used in housing estates, most of the residents are unaware of their significance to Boston.
I think to compound, to make it worse, this confusion between Pilgrims and Puritans, in the interwar period, that's talking between the First and Second World Wars, of course, from our point of view, for many years there was an annual pilgrimage, use of the word, you see, an annual pilgrimage from this Boston to our Boston, but I think it was it was visiting St. Botolph's, and it was very much related to the restoration of St. Botolph's. So one way and another, the two stories have merged, and really, Richard said it's more dramatic. I think in these days you'd say the Pilgrim story is perhaps a sexier story, isn't it, than the Puritan one.
Thank you. So, getting to the Puritans, Neil, can you tell us why so many of them left Boston, England, for New England in the 1630s?
Right, well, as people have been hinted, the situation is changing after King Charles I came to the throne in 1625. What you had, as I hinted earlier, is you have an unusual situation in Boston, Lincolnshire, because the corporation had been formed specifically in 1545, which is just after King Henry VIII had suppressed the monasteries and had then suppressed a rebellion and uprising in Lincolnshire. The king had seized property from the monasteries that existed in Boston. He had taken property from Lord Hussey, who had been executed for treason, who also held property in Boston. Knights Hospitallers had been suppressed, and other orders had been suppressed, and the king had got a whole lot of land that previously belonged to these various institutions. So when Boston Corporation was created, it wasn't simply a government body, but they actually received, in return for some financial contribution which they gave gave to the king not only a charter giving them rights of government in the town, but a whole collection of property, so they were considerably responsible for receiving such this income. But they also received the right to appoint the vicar to the parish church, which had previously been done by a monastery, and they also received the right to appoint the master of the grammar school, who had been previously an employee of one of the medieval guilds. So a whole lot of powers were concentrated in the corporation. At a different period of time, they might not have got quite so many. This meant that not only was the political body running the town in alliance with appointing the vicar and appointing the master of the grammar school, and also involved in appointing the member of parliament, once one of those groups became dominated by the ideas of the Puritans, the political, the religious, the administrative, the educational aspects of the town were all in puritanical hands, as it were. And in another town you might have had the vicar who was expressing puritanical ideas, but he could have been censured by the local corporation or even by the magistrate, and vice versa. If the corporation had shown puritanical views, they could have been censured from the pulpit for that. In Boston, all of those agencies were in agreement with holding the same sort of views, and this created an environment within Boston, Lincolnshire, in which every aspect of life, amongst the Galling elite, no doubt there were some people amongst the citizenry who were held to slightly different views, traditional sort of Anglican views, but amongst the group running the town, the elite at the top of the town and the middle ranks of the town, the strong unity, the strong feeling that they had got a Puritan community here in Boston. King Charles comes to the throne, 1625, and he starts to change things. He starts to rule without Parliament, very briefly, quickly after coming to power, and so that puts a threat on the political powers within the country, don't have any influence so much on him. He also then holds ideas with relation to religion to more enforce conformity to the principles of the Church of England, and so starts putting pressure on the churches and people's religious views within throughout the country. In Lincolnshire there was a slight help to Boston in the beginning, in that the Bishop of Lincoln, who had oversight of the whole county, including Boston, he was more tolerant, and his attitude really to Boston was, he asked the corporation, having received some complaints, he asked the corporation, are you satisfied with the conduct and the behaviour of your vicar? And of course they're completely satisfied. They were completely pleased. He was giving them exactly what they wanted, so they responded, yes, we're happy with him. And the bishop says, the people of Boston are happy, and so I'm prepared to that. He didn't ask them, is he conforming to the rules of the Church of England? He didn't ask that question. Unfortunately, later got into trouble, but that meant that he was not going to interfere and stop. But gradually, pressure was being applied from the centre. Pressure was put on John Cotton. We heard some reference to the Earl of Lincoln and members of Boston Corporation being imprisoned. So, in the political side and in the religious side, pressure was building. And it appears to me what was happening, you had an environment, a puritanical environment. They had built up, they had been at least 10 years happy with the sort of society which they had created, religious, political, and so on, and that was under threat. And I think they already knew from the experience of the Pilgrims, no good going over to Holland, that's too worldly for you, but they also knew from the experience of the Pilgrims there was scope in New England for somewhere to move where they could create. And so they decided, as a group who knew each other throughout the 10 years, and this is it, they are, when people's references are made in Massachusetts to the Boston men, they're not just talking to the men from this Boston running the colony, they are very much in the 17th century talking about the men from Boston, Lincolnshire, as a group running this particular colony, very much dominating this colony. So you get this situation, they are virtually all agreeing that they are going to emigrate, and gradually over the period from 1630, and then Cotton himself coming in 1633, and others come in succeeding years as well, but gradually a very large number of people from Boston and Lincolnshire make this move. I have a reference has been made already to the forced loan. This was one of these efforts right at the start of the process, which the king was trying to rule without Parliament and trying to obtain funding by other means. And so that was the sort of effort that led to the impeachment and the political pressure that was put upon them. I think that's all we can say.
Great. Thank you very much, Neil. Now, here in, of course, Massachusetts, we give a great starring role in this to John Winthrop, but from what Neil has just been saying, men from Boston played a leading role in the formation of the Massachusetts Bay Company. So I would like Barry to discuss the role of Winthrop and how you respond to the demystifying of John Winthrop that we've just heard.
Well, by no means is there any intention to diminish John Winthrop's role and what, the role he played in history. I mean, after all, I'm president emeritus of the Winthrop Society, so, I can't disparage him. But the focus is that the story of the Boston men has not really been told, okay? If we look at the next slide, okay, John Winthrop's involvement in no, you need to go back, please. Okay, back. All right, here we are. Okay. John Winthrop's involvement in the Massachusetts Bay Company is shown here in green, and that of the Boston men in yellow. In a 1629 letter from Isaac Johnson to Winthrop's son-in-law, Emmanuel Downing Johnson wrote, "It was an excellent time for Mr. Winthrop to have been at this commencement at Cambridge, where I hear there were many reverend divines to hear Mr. White's call." Johnson is referring to John Winthrop having attended a Cambridge graduation on July 7th in 1629, at which Reverend John White, who was the leader of the defunct Dorchester Company, hoped to gain support for the newly established Massachusetts Bay Company. And soon afterward, on July 28th, Winthrop joined Emmanuel Downing, his son-in-law, and attended a meeting at Sempringham that took place at the home of the Dowager Countess of Lincoln, where Dudley also lived with his family. A month later, following this timeline, on August 26th, Winthrop attended a meeting at Cambridge University and signed what we know as the Cambridge Agreement, along with Isaac Johnson, John Humphrey, and Thomas Dudley. That same day in London, an identical meeting took place of the General Court of the Massachusetts Bay Company at the home of Matthew Craddock. At both meetings, it was agreed to split the governance of the Massachusetts Bay Company between London and New England, but they would send their charter to New England. But it wasn't until October 20th in 1629 that Winthrop first appeared, actually is mentioned in the records of the Massachusetts Bay Company. On that day, the General Court met to elect the governor who was to accompany those migrating to Massachusetts. Winthrop was nominated along with Richard Saltonstall, Isaac Johnson, and John Humphrey, and he was elected governor, even though he'd only become involved maybe 3 months before. Now, to my mind, that election result was prearranged to minimize the friction or potential friction between the London investors, who were headed by Matthew Craddock, and the Boston men, headed by Isaac Johnson and Thomas Dudley. Recalling Thomas Dudley's 1631 letter to the Countess of Lincoln, he said, and this was after he had arrived in Massachusetts, he wrote back to the Countess of Lincoln saying, about the year 1627, okay, which is 2 years even prior to what I've just been talking about the year 1627, some friends being together in Lincolnshire fell into some discourse about New England and the planning of the gospel there. After some deliberation, we imparted our reasons by letters and messages to some in London and the West Country. Now, by the West Country, he meant John Humphrey and the Dorchester Company. And 1627 was the very year that Boston united against the forced loan, okay? So there's this turmoil going on. The Earl's been thrown in the Tower. Thomas Dudley and Isaac Johnson led the resistance in Boston, Lincolnshire. By then, Isaac Johnson and John Humphrey had become very close friends, And in April 1627, Johnson actually asked Humphrey to witness the signing of his last will and testament at Sempringham, okay? That just to demonstrate how close they'd become. Later, Humphrey became his brother-in-law by marrying Lady Susan, the younger sister of Lady Arbella. So after the Dorchester went bankrupt in 1626, its founder, Reverend John White, and its treasurer, John Humphrey, sought new investors to restart the company and appealed to a group of wealthy Puritans in London. The venture, however, required the approval of the Council of New England, headed by the already infamous, I hope, Earl of Warwick, and the pirate, who made it clear to them gentlemen of blood were needed before he'd approve it. And in response, they went back to the Devon area where Dorchester was, and they got Sir Henry Roswell, Sir John Young, and Simon Whitcomb to agree to be named in this effort to get this grant of land. And in addition to those three gentlemen, two original members of the Dorchester Company, Thomas Southcote and John Humphrey, were added to that list, along with, and I'm sure you've heard this name, John Endicott, who was a relative unknown, but he came out of nowhere because he volunteered to go on this. He was willing to immigrate. So in March 1628, Warwick granted these 6 men land in New England. Now, from there to the transition to the Mass Bay Charter, things get a little cloudy because a lot of the records are gone. But 2 months later, that effort where those 6 men were named on a grant, it morphed into what was known as the New England Company. The New England Company, 2 of its founding members were Isaac Johnson and the MP from Boston, Richard Bellingham, who in a big way first enters the picture here, okay? Later, of course, he became an infamous governor in Massachusetts. So by February of the next year, the New England Company again morphed into the Mass Bay Company, all right? And a month later, on March 2nd, the town of Boston was first mentioned in the actual records of the Massachusetts Bay Company when Thomas Coney, who Neil had mentioned earlier, who was the town recorder, presented a proposal to the Mass Bay Company that 10 men from Boston wanted to pledge 25 pounds each in joint stock to join the company. The 10 were Isaac Johnson, Richard Bellingham, Simon Bradstreet, Thomas Dudley, Thomas Leverett, William Coddington, Charles Fines, the younger brother of Lady Arbella, Abraham Mellows, and Herbert Pelham. 2 days later, from that meeting, the king approved the Massachusetts Bay Royal Charter. So to sum up, the friendship between Isaac Johnson and John Humphrey connected the Boston, Lincolnshire area with the remnants of this defunct Dorchester Company and gave rise to the New England Company, which Humphrey and Bellingham were founding members of, which in turn morphed into the Mass Bay Company, of which 10 members were, and named on the charter, were 10 Boston men. And so when we say Boston men, we usually refer to these 10. Now, John Winthrop was first invited to join this venture by Isaac Johnson in July 1629. And later in October, he attended his first meeting of the colony. So, you know, he was a latecomer, and as I mentioned earlier, to my mind, he was a compromise between London and the Boston men. But to conclude my response, I want to highlight the contributions that these Boston men made after they arrived in Massachusetts, okay? So on this next slide, although it might be hard to read, don't worry about that. It serves to illustrate the service of the Boston men shown in black, all right? from 1628, okay, which is actually, you know, when the Mass Bay Company really began, to 1692, Boston men occupied the position of governor or deputy governor 94% of that total time. 94%, all right? John Winthrop's term of offices are shown in the yellow highlight, okay? So, you know, we hear so much about Winthrop, but you've got to realize that the contribution coming from the Boston, England, was immense. And not everybody has connected these dots, but they need to be connected. In the next slide, 4 of these Boston men, Thomas Dudley, Richard Bellingham, John Leverett, the son of Thomas, and Simon Bradstreet, served Massachusetts a total of 28 years as governor, 28 years as deputy governor, and have a combined total 81 years as assistants and a total combined service of 137 years. So, you know, I contend that the impact of this single cohesive group of men from Boston, England, has yet to really be fully recognized on either side of the Atlantic, okay? And so I'm making that my cause.
Hear, hear. Now, Eve, I wonder if you can tell us a bit about the individuals from Boston who migrated to New England and what united this group.
I think there's a slide for this. This is
Next slide.
Relatively quick, but we were just going to briefly show you the immigration numbers for the 20 years that people were coming from Boston and environs, and it's about 250 people. By the years, you see the biggest year of immigration is 1634, that was the year Anne Hutchinson came in. I think it was the result of the immigration the year before of John Cotton, for whom supposedly Boston was named. This Boston was named either it was his idea or other people did it to make him feel more at home when he came here. But and these people were immigrating, these 250 people were coming as families, large groups with servants. They were people of means for the most part, unlike some of the other early colonies where they were mostly men or people that were perhaps even just who were forced to go there. These were well-to-do families, and many of whom knew each other, and the Boston families would be, the ones that came later would be affiliated family members or friends of the ones who were already here.
I think this would be a good time to open up to questions from the very attentive and learned audience.
Well, there's so many questions, but especially, you know, I think both from either Boston. Why did John Cotton come late? It's, I think, 1633. If there's so much of an impact of Boston coming in, and I do understand like something about the Boston men, but what was John Cotton's delay?
Well, you know, actually, I'm of the mind that he never wanted to leave Cambridge because he loved being an academic. But once he became a vicar, the biggest event in his life that was actually totally life-changing was to become vicar of Boston, he had to marry. And having led a celibate life, I guess, for so long, his mentors actually arranged a wife for him. And, you know, it's told by Cotton Mather, it totally transformed him to where it is said that he is probably the most erotic Puritan you'll find. He loved the Song of Solomon, and he loved the erotic imagery. He literally spoke Hebrew. He wrote poems in Koine Greek. When two of his children died of smallpox, he wrote poems to them in Greek. So he embraced this Hebrewness of the Old Testament more than the New Testament, I think. And he used all that eroticism to where he talked about, you know, my congregation suckle from the breast of the word. And one scholar says he is the only Puritan Puritan who saw himself as the bride of Christ, okay? So when he went to preach at Southampton to the departing, okay, well, he had a wife, okay, and so he came back and the two of them came down with malaria. So, you know, he was taken into the house of the Earl of Lincoln, and both of them were, and he recovered, she didn't. And so that was probably the most devastating event in his life, was losing that woman he loved desperately. A couple of years later, he was married, they married him off to Sarah Hockred, who her husband had died. And so at the same time, I think he wanted to stay as a vicar. I don't think he enjoyed change, but it was forced upon him. And when Archbishop Laud, well, when he became Archbishop and Arminianism ruled, the king and Buckingham before him decided that we would be Arminian rather than Calvinist, Laud went after Cotton, and he was issued a warrant to appear before the Star Chamber. And then he went into hiding, and his wife was pregnant. He's hiding out in London, and he thought, what am I going to do? He talked to Hooker, he talked to Shepherd. They thought about going to Holland, but in the end he decided he'd go to Boston with his congregation. And so he got on that ship somewhat unwillingly. I think he would have rather stayed in England, quite frankly. Yeah.
Thank you. The Erotic Puritan sounds like a good name for a bar.
Really?
Yeah.
You know what what do you call that thing when you train children? Catechism?
Yes.
Is called Spiritual Milk for Babes of Both Bostons, drawn out of both breasts of the Bible, Old and New. Okay, and this is for children. And you've heard of the New England Primer, which, you know, was the textbook up until about mid 19th century. His catechism was usually a part of the New England Primer. And
can you just talk briefly about the 10 Boston men's governance of Boston, Massachusetts, separate from church governance? Didn't they, or could you say, what they did was set sort of our nascent democratic institutions? And if that's so, is that a way to begin to reframe the story or get people to understand that the Puritans aren't just an adjective that we think is puritanical? Because it wasn't strictly, it was, you know, people lived here, they were part of the church, but there was also separation too. So can you comment on that a little bit?
well, shall I take it? Actually, their governance was written pretty much into the charter, and it followed pretty much the way the governance of the town of Boston. You know, they had so many assemblymen, and then they would have a governor and a deputy governor, and that would be elected annually. Okay, so the competition for governor and all, I don't know how those elections exactly went down. We know there was a rivalry between Winthrop and Dudley, but then we had Henry Vane pop up. I mean, he was the real Mick Jagger of Boston. I mean, you know, this flashy cavalier. I mean, you've seen his statue at the public library. So, you know, they wrestled with governance, and you know, Cotton wrote a tract where he said, you know, democracy is a vile form of government, because he believed that they were the chosen people. Okay, his speech at Southampton, you know, there's a wonderful book by Sarah Vowell called Wordy Shipmates, where she says that American exceptionalism started with Cotton's sermon at Southampton, because he said, these are a chosen people, this is a mission from God, that it's like a divine destiny. So one of his students that he sent to Emmanuel College from Boston actually ended up writing, what were the final laws that were implemented in Massachusetts?
The Body of Liberties?
The Body of Liberties. He actually helped author that. but I don't think any of them saw it as a democracy because women were excluded. There was, you had to be a free man. To be a free man, you had to meet certain criteria. And so, it came, I think that came later, okay? Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
I'll just make a comment on that, actually. An interesting thing is that it was almost less democratic than back in England, because in England, although there was a limited number of freemen, all freemen could vote in the parliamentary elections in England, whereas in Massachusetts, the freemen needed to be members of the church, so that it was a much narrower sort of electorate, as it were, than we had back in England, which is a bit perverse, considering, you think you come here and it's more democratic, but it was, in that particular case, it was slightly narrower.
But they were saints, right? They were saints.
Yes.
I'm thinking of the six of you as micro-historians, and I'm in awe, so I hope I can ask my question and be in line with what you presented here this evening. I'm curious to know, in comparison the Pilgrims with the Puritans, the Pilgrims were poorer than the Puritans. There were fewer of them. The Puritans came with 133 farmers, and they were 10 years, after the Pilgrims arriving here. What would the Puritans have known about the Pilgrims here in Plymouth that would have affected what they put together when they came here, aside from the religious influence?
Very good question.
Well, I don't know how in touch they were prior to sailing. They had sent out, William Blackstone was, here in Massachusetts in 1623. Now, I know he communicated, there's no letters, but he obviously communicated back to Isaac Johnson, who was his best friend. And Robert Gorges, he went, looked, and went home, okay? And the Plymouth people reviled him, and they wrote, there's some very amusing things they had to say about Robert Gorges because he didn't stay, okay? And a couple of his company ended up being seen as hedonistic, and the Pilgrims didn't get along with them. So those people from the Gorges company, and then later when Endicott and that group came over, because there was a voyage about 1628, right after the formation of the New England Company, where Endicott went, and they landed at Salem. So when the Winthrop fleet came over, they first went to Salem, and there was already an established community there. So, and that community in Salem had made contact with the Pilgrims. But I think most of the feedback went from the ventures that they were more familiar with, And of course, about half of the Mayflower were strangers that were paying passengers that helped make it possible for the Mayflower to sail because they paid, where all of the Pilgrims were literally indentured to that company because they didn't pay. So,
I just wanted to add something. Most of the people on the panel attended a meeting today with two representatives of Mayor Walsh's administration, and among other things, talking about the celebrations for 2030, when we will be 400 years old, our Boston. And I just wanted to point out that in 1930, I don't think any of us are old enough to remember that celebration, but we brought over their mayor at the time for an entire week of festivities. And on September 16th of 1930, there was a town meeting and public reception for his worship, Reuben Salter, the mayor of Boston, England. It was broadcast on radio. The guests included governors of the states and mayors of New England and Canadian cities. Music was performed by the Tercentenary municipal band and a chorus of 2,000 school children. Wow. 2,000 school children. Where do you think they held that? The brand new Boston Garden, which is torn down now.
And Fred, do you have a question?
Just wondering what happened to St. Petrol's Church, the congregation, after so many people left. How did it manage to survive?
That's a very good question. What happened to the church in Boston when so many people left?
It continued just with a reduced number of people, because there were obviously, I would guess, some sort of Puritans who stayed behind and didn't emigrate. We had a new vicar, Mr. Tuckney, who took over, but he was obviously quite closely related to the group that were leaving, but was also more acceptable to the authorities. So basically the church sort of became acceptable within the rules of the Church of England, but at the same time there were probably other people within the town who were thinking of other ways. This then sort of, we're moving on, if you move on then we very quickly get into the English Civil War. That means effectively for that particular period the Church of England is suspended, bishops disappear, the whole ethos of the Church of England changes. And although when we get to the Restoration in 1660, the result of that is that we start to find independent congregations, not necessarily Unitarians, but Baptists and other groups start to appear. So these are the people who would have been continued in Boston after that period. So they were stealing, this nonconformist opinion was still continuing, although the church itself had to sort of conform more to the traditions of the Church of England. Is that a sufficient answer, I think?
Yeah, and as Neil mentioned, it was a very smooth transition because Anthony Tuckney was actually a cousin of Sarah Hawkred, who John Cotton had married. And, you know, when he was ill, Tuckney, he had actually helped Tuckney get into Emmanuel College. So he was there living in Cotton's house and being nurtured by him. So it was a very smooth transition. When Cotton became ill, Tuckney actually took over at that point. So even while Cotton was in hiding, before he migrated, Tuckney had pretty much taken over the role of vicar.
Well, thank you all.